Just a quick note before we begin, the views shared in this conversation are solely those of the speakers and do not reflect any official position of the US Department of Defense or the US government.
Know yourself, know others, and then think more creatively than your adversary. And I believe the areas of innovation and creative thinking and critical thinking requires a multi-paradigmic view. If we
Yes.
don't have this, we are at a handicap, and if our adversary has this, they have the advantage no matter what.
Welcome to Strategy Meets Reality podcast. I'm your host Mike Jones, and today I'm joined by Ben Zweibelson, veteran, military strategist and author of Reconceptualizing War. We explore how dominant paradigms shape the way we think about conflict and strategy, why complexity demands more than doctrine, and how multi-paradigm thinking can open up radically different ways to act, adapt and make sense in modern warfare and beyond. Welcome back to Strategy Meets Reality podcast. I'm your host Mike Jones, and today I'm glad to announce that I'm joined by Ben Zweibelson. Is that correct?
Yep, that's right. You nailed it,
Yeah.
Mike.
Here we go.
Thanks.
Cool.
That's the only time you can say it.
It's great to have you on the show. And just for the listeners, to get a feel about you, can you give a quick introduction about yourself and a bit of context about what you've been up to lately?
Sure. I'm a retired American Army soldier. I did 22 years in the military. Before that, I was an art student. Fine art
Well,
student was kind of odd.
yeah.
But over the last 10 years or so, I've really been on this kind of intellectual journey, challenging what strategy is, how we look at warfare, conflict, a lot of philosophy. So my doctorate's in philosophy, and I still work in the military now as a government employee. But this work I've been doing academically, this is separate. This is kind of my passion to bring things back to the military to help teach the next generation. So I do a lot of writing, a lot of lecturing, a lot of speaking, a lot of blogging, all sorts of stuff. And actually, this book is my third book, Reconceptualizing War, through Helion and Company, which is a UK publisher. And today, if we want, I'm actually going to sign with Helion, have the contract on my computer to commit my fourth book, which is done, and it'll
Oh, yeah.
publish. Yeah, it'll publish in the spring of next year, 2026. And this new one is called Bad War Stories. And so that's brand new information for
Well,
not just for your viewers, but this is the first public announcement that Bad War Stories is a nonfiction memoir that's based on all the real events that I experienced in 4 combat tours, 2 in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan. And this, honestly, for me, was a decompression from writing the book we're going to talk about today, Reconceptualizing War, which is a very, very heavy philosophical and sociological lift. You know, it's got thousands of footnotes. It's 742 pages. It hurt my head to write it. So
I've
the
got to
new
hear.
book, yeah, there it is. Look at that. If you don't like the book, it's good as a self-defense weapon or holding a door open.
It is a very good book. I must admit, I'm not all the way through because I only recently got it, but I'm majority way through and I've really enjoyed it. But to your point about your new book you're writing, you say you're about to sign the contract. Do you want?
Yeah, yeah. So if you want, since we're on video here, let me hit share screen. And let's just do something kind of cool for, let's see, how do I do this?
Oh, there we go.
All
Cool.
right, now, can you see the
Oh, wow,
contract?
that's cool. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
All
Just
right,
your,
let's do this. So live for viewers. There it is. And bam, signed.
nice. Happy days. So that's going to be
So
for
now,
your fourth book.
yeah, that's the fourth book, and that'll be out next next spring. And this is a shorter book, Bad War Stories, and it's a series of different chapters. It's done is like a Catch-22 meets Pulp Fiction, where I do everything kind of out of
Mm.
order. But each chapter talks about an experience or series of experiences that I had in one of my combat tours. But this is not your garden variety military memoirs. You know, there I was, knee deep in hand grenade pins and all this nonsense, right? This is much more appealing to military veterans and for the general public who really want to know what is combat really like? What are the things that really happen? And for most infantry and ground pounders and people that are out there every day, it's mostly boring and
Mm.
uncomfortable and hot and irritating. And then there's brief moments of confusion and shock, sometimes excitement mixed with a lot of other emotions. And then also a lot of sadness. And there's a lot of things that you see where you say, how are our organizations doing this? Why do we do this? This is insanity. And yet
Yeah.
you keep doing it. And real quick vignette. My last tour in Afghanistan was during one of the drawdowns in 2014. And I was smashing satellite phones in a dumpster in Kandahar to get them off my forward property books because of the rules for money and equipment made it so that you couldn't even bring it back with you and use it on your rear property books because those things were paid for with different money. And so they couldn't leave Afghanistan. And then over about a half a mile away, they were shredding MRAPs, those large, bulky, up armored. They were shredding them and destroying them. And you're looking around going like, this is madness. Why? What are we doing? So the book is filled with a lot of things like that. But that's more of like a fun decompression for me.
Yeah.
This book, the book that we're going to talk about today, Reconceptualizing War, which is available now on Amazon and at Casemate. And then if you're in the UK, you want to go to the Helion and Company website because that's the lowest price. And in the UK, the shipping and everything is great. If you don't live in the UK, it's a little more expensive. So I think Amazon is probably the best option. But this book, Reconceptualizing War, this looks at the philosophy of what our species determines as organized violence, conflict. And I I take a modern framing of, what we as a species do right now, but I base it upon everything that's kind of led us to this point. So we're going back into the Napoleonic era. We're going to go back all the way to Sun Tzu. We're going to go back to Greco-Roman origins. And even before that, I even briefly touch on Paleolithic
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
hunter-gatherers, right?
Yeah. And I like that because when you think about strategy and the modern version of strategy, a lot of that has come from people talk about Sun Tzu, Clausewitz, all those as the sort of the forefathers of strategy. So it's good to understand where this has all come from and what has led it to this point where this is how we view the world and it's how we adopt and execute strategy.
Right, right. And what we say strategy is today is very different from what strategy originally was comprised of and understood of. And between that there's a split because if we talk about the antiquities of the beginning of human civilization and we look at when we were able to lay down agriculture to then afford ourselves to have specialized jobs. So we had priests, we had ruling leadership, and we had military, and we had some sort of law enforcement, and all these things were possible only after we abandoned being hunter-gatherers. And if we look back with anthropologists, and anthropologists have really studied this hard, and one of those very, very difficult, maybe impossible to answer questions is, was there war all the way back to our primordial origins, right? So hunter-gatherers. And nobody can say definitively. You can't really
Yeah,
say.
yeah.
But the evidence that's currently available, number one, you look at cave paintings, right? And so the cave paintings and me being originally a fine artist and oil painter, I'm an extension of the cave painters, right? There's this beautiful cosmic element, but they didn't paint war. They painted hunting and they painted a lot of other things, but they didn't
Yeah,
paint
yeah.
war ever. They've never found a war painting, which is challenging, okay? And then when we look at the tools and the weapons and the items that they've left behind, and they appear to be exclusively used for hunting. Now, were there acts of primitive violence? Certainly, certainly. You look at all sorts of examples, but this is important in the book. And I use three primary sources for this book. First is philosophy overall. And with that comes the work of Anatole Rappaport, who was a very important games theorist in the 20th century. He did philosophy, he did mathematics, he did complexity theory, he did all these amazing things. But he's kind of a persona non grata in most military circles because he was a prolific Vietnam War activist, anti-war activist.
Yeah, yeah.
So much so that he actually fled the United States and spent the rest of his life in Canada and said he didn't want to have anything to do with the United States after that, even though he fought in World War II, or he served in World War II. The other two are sociologists, Burrell and Morgan,
Yeah.
and they established social paradigm theory. And so I use those as my cornerstone. But the challenge then becomes violence, human beings, violence, right? So there's organized violence. This is what we're categorizing as conflict and war. And then it's not disorganized violence, but it's just violence. And that's the thing that falls outside. So this is crime, this is domestic strife, assault, all sorts of things that
Yeah,
happen. And so did that happen in hunter-gatherer period? Of course. And in
yeah,
fact,
yeah,
that was probably the leading form of violence because you didn't have organized violence until you had civilizations. You had to have enough specialization to have some sort of political, ideological leadership that could charge the society with saying, we're going to war and here's why. And
yeah,
then you had
yeah.
to have a military. You had to have some sort of military force that went out and became that instrument of power for that society. And so that's what organized violence is. And that's what the book kind of sets up into. Well, there are these paradigms, these frames of how we look at war, and how certain groups look at war, organized violence, differs from how others do.
Okay, that's really interesting. So, when you think about reconceptualizing war, how are sort of the lessons that you pulled out from there? How does that help us now think about how do we reconceptualize strategy?
This is, I think, the most important thing for listeners who are involved in military education or military leadership or policy or foreign affairs, any of these things that a lot of people spend a lot of time working on. And this book argues simply that almost all of us are guilty of one thing. And I was guilty of this for a very, very long time myself because I'm a product of the system. I'm a product of the American military system.
Yeah,
And this cardinal sin is that we all adhere to a single social paradigm, a war paradigm. And that's the one that is entrenched in how we look at all conflict. And therefore, we interpret all these conflicts. And we'll talk about some of the current ones today. So we can talk about Hamas and Israel. Very currently, we can talk about Israel and Iran. We can
oh
talk
yeah, yeah,
about Russia and the Ukraine. We can talk about the Cold War between the United States and China.
yeah, yeah,
So in all of these, the problem is that the Americans, the Brits, the Australians, the Canadians, they look at, say, Israel and Hamas, this conflict, and they look at it through one war paradigm, and it's what we call functionalism.
yeah. I
And
was gonna say,
it's through all of our doctrine. It's through everything, right? It's through our education. Challenge, though, is that Hamas uses a different war paradigm, and I explain that in my book, and I talk about these doomsday ideological groups. And we use Anatole Rappaport's construct. And he wrote about this in the 1960s in his introduction to Clausewitz's On War, which the Clausewitzian defenders hate this because his introduction disrupted the single paradigm that Clausewitz is everything, right? And that's one of the problems. If you talk with Westerners who are functionalists, they'll say it's all Clausewitz and Jomini, right? It's all
yeah, yeah.
Clausewitz and Jomini.
Just
And then, well, building upon that, all the other thinkers, Mahan, Corbett, Dohet, Boyd, they all build off of that. But when we go against someone or groups who aren't Clausewitzian, that aren't functionalists, such as Marxists, all right, so Marxists don't use Clausewitz the same way whatsoever. And that's just one example. I'll pause there because I know
yeah.
you
So
wanted to say something.
yeah, just thinking about just so our listeners understand about functionalism. How would you describe that for our listeners?
Yeah, so let's just do the screen share. Figure 3 from the book. And this is, again, this is pure Gibson Burrell and Gareth Morgan. So Burrell and Morgan in the 1970s, they came up with a social paradigm theory, and they were building off of when most listeners hear the word paradigm, they think of a scientific paradigm, and that was the coined by Thomas Kuhn and his incredible groundbreaking book. But Kuhn was looking at scientific paradigms, and what he meant by this essentially was, in a nutshell, to compress his book into 30 seconds, is that scientific paradigm occupies how the world looks and approaches and does things scientifically until it doesn't work anymore. And then as it's breaking down, the defenders of the paradigm will just continue to do busy work to keep propping it up so that it just barely continues to function. But there's a couple of outliers who then say, hey, we need to bring in this entirely new scientific paradigm. And if they do successfully, it replaces and destroys the previous paradigm, and then all of society moves into the new scientific paradigm. So we saw this with Newtonian thinking that replaced non-scientific Western thinking. So that was a
Yeah,
paradigm shift. And then we had it again at the beginning of the 20th century with general relativity and quantum. Those two together replaced and dislodged the Newtonian worldview. And the case in point is that if anybody looks up overhead at the heavens, over 100 kilometers up, we have low Earth orbit. And those things that are in orbit right now, such as the International Space Station and all those satellites, if we were just still using Newtonian physics, none of that would be there. It wouldn't be
Yeah,
able
yeah,
to be because it would crash, it would explode. None of that would work. The only way that stuff is working is because our civilization was able to transcend out of the Newtonian scientific paradigm that was working for about four or five centuries. That was good enough, but it wasn't good enough to get us to this next level. And so that's how Kuhn was talking about scientific paradigms. In the 1970s, Burrell and Morgan, as sociologists, said, hey, we need to adapt this type of paradigm thinking and look at how different groups of human beings construct a social reality, and they're different. Because if you go into a Sino-Marxist society, such as China, and then you look at how they value things, how they have a belief system, how they believe at these very deep philosophical levels. So ontology, which is we know what is and is not real. And
yeah,
then the other word is epistemology, which is how we know how knowledge is conveyed and constructed and how things go,
yeah,
right? Ontology and epistemology of a Sino-Marxist society is fundamentally in a different paradigm than we have for, say, functionalist Westerners. And that's in the lower left-hand corner of this graphic is where we start with functionalism. And that's what I spend chapters 3 and 4 explaining to the readers how really everything that we do, from policy to strategy down to tactics. I don't talk too much about tactics because that's a misnomer. Bullets and bombs and trench knives, they're all the same, but the difference is the person wielding them. If they believe in a different social reality, now we're up at this philosophical level, but that will drive the whole purpose of the war, the conflict. It'll drive their strategy, it'll drive their strategic goals. And if
yeah,
these
yeah,
things are different, we're simply just fighting a war where we're shouting past each other while shooting at each other.
yeah. You see it when you talk about functionalism. Our institutions that we've created are supportive of that. We've created the structures that reinforce functionalism, um, and you see that a lot of people that have got to the position where they are aren't willing to let go of the structures and systems that have got them there. So
Yeah,
you pretty
yeah.
much reinforce them.
If we go back to just these first two slides here, so the way that the Barella-Morgan framework works, and that's the quadrant that I adapt, and then I build upon it and I add to it. They talk about the objective to the subjective, and this creates kind of your framework, your first framework. So that's the horizontal bar there, in an objective reality versus a subjective reality. And then in figure 2, and I do all this in the first 2 chapters,
Yeah,
we talk about conflict and order. And what we mean by that, what Burrell and Morgan were originally saying, is that this is what reality is. It's if it's an ordered reality, then you have a stable set worldview. Whereas if it's in conflict or change, that means that reality itself can transform over time. So when we move to this slide, slide 3, the reason that functionalism is in the lower left corner at the intersection of an objective and ordered reality, the easiest thing for most readers that are probably familiar with the functionalist mindset, Clausewitz, Jomini, all these different thinkers, Fuller, Littlehart, they'll all tell you the same thing, and that is that war has a changing character but a unchanging or enduring natural order. And so when you hear that statement, that is an ontological statement. It's
yeah,
saying that no matter what war you have, you could be talking about the Peloponnesian War, you could be talking about the emerging Iran-Iraq war that's happening right now. All the wars between them and every future war must obey this nature of war that is defined in different ways. Jomini, Clausewitz, and others,
yeah,
right? But to do that, you're saying that war itself and how human beings experience war, it'll always fall within that certain ordered nature, just as gravity is always going to exist for human beings on the planet Earth. On a celestial body, you're always going to have gravity. There's a certitude there, right?
yeah,
Difference that's important for readers to grasp is that physics, right? So if we're talking about physics, we're talking about chemistry, we're talking about biology, all those things, yes, those have a certain order to them that extends beyond human beings. And the easy way to think about this philosophically is that, did gravity exist before the first humans were able to think about gravity? Certainly.
Hmm.
Absolutely. There's gravity that was around well before the dinosaurs, right? Gravity is an enduring, constant nature. But did war exist before humans could wage it?
No.
Did dinosaurs have war, right? And this is where there's a philosophical divide. And I write this book advocating there's one of two positions. Either you say that war has always been there, and that and there's various arguments on this. Some will say that it's just an enduring quality that was just there but not used. It was dormant, which again there's certain ontological and epistemological choices there. And then others have made the argument that it's tied into our evolution. So it's an evolutionary argument that violence in a certain form has always been kind of part of the human condition, and therefore it's inseparable from us, right? And that's more of an anthropological slash biological argument. But these are grounded still in functionalism, because
Yeah, yeah.
they're, yeah, you're pairing war, a social construct, with these hard physics constructs, right? And that's what I tease out as, well, all these other social paradigms that are available here. So we have radical structuralism, radical humanism, and interpretivism. These terms all came from Burrell and Morgan. But these are different paradigms where war can be understood quite differently. And then I lay out the examples of how China today is a great example of radical structuralism. And they're an extension of the Soviet Union and Cuba and all these other communist experiments that are state-based systems. Radical humanism has postmodern and critical theory elements, which links back to World War One and some of the frustrations that Marxists had coming out of World War One. And this was the social Marxist movement that began in the 1920s and has manifested today, where you have university activists making a strange combination of, say, gays for Gaza, right? That's a it's a bumper sticker.
Yeah,
But what you really have is you have Western movements and groups that associate homosexual or gay, lesbian, LGBT, all that. They pair those constructs, which links back to critical race and critical gender theory. So these are critical theory constructs that date all the way back to two different planks: the Gramsci school out of Italy and Marxist Italian thinking, and then the Frankfurt School, which really rose out of the ashes of German disillusionment in the interwar period with what happened with Russia. It was
yeah,
not supposed to be a Russian revolution. It was supposed to be a Marxist revolution in Berlin or London or Paris. And they were frustrated and dejected. And they said, well, we got to rethink Marx. These things develop into social Marxism, but this is also where you have the Gays for Gaza. You have social Marxists advocating with radical eschatological or ideological movements, and that's where Hamas is. So they wouldn't work together. They would kill each other if they were left on the same battlefield. But they have a common enemy in that they're trying to destroy the entire Western modern system. This is radical humanism and functionalism at war, with Hamas really being an extension. It'd be further down. Let's just advance here to chapter 6. Just give me one. Here we go. Radical omnism, which is an extension of radical structuralism. So I've got the Islamic State, Al Qaeda. We've got the Shinriko from Japan, Hamas, Boko Haram, Branch Davidian. So I try to hit a whole bunch of different groups, not just Islamic radical terror groups, although they are a very useful example today. But
yeah, yeah.
these are strange bedfellows, but they all have certain ontological and epistemological alignments that allows radical omnists to then play around with global cataclysmic groups here. So we've got different anarchists and radical extremist groups. And then they move into radical humanism. This is in chapter 7. You see here Frankfurt School, Horkheimer, Adorno, Marcuse, all these different 20th century thinkers that were reinterpreting Marx after World War One. I know I just said a whole bunch of stuff here. So let's dive back. Where do you want to circle back to?
Well, how? just looking on this and thinking about, you said about China being radical structuralism, you got the West being functionalism. We're looking at um, strategy and how, well, I always look at it and go, well, the modern view of strategy is fundamentally broken because it predicates on three main theories that aren't true: the world's stable, linear causal relationship, and the world's predictable, which a lot of that sits into functionalism. So what are the other paradigms that can help people sort of move from? Because I know in your book you adopt that it's not one, it's not one paradigm. It's useful to understand all four paradigms and how you can use them.
Great question. I'll jump into, I talk about this in the eighth chapter. And again, we have to kind of lay all the groundwork. And the organization of the book is that in the first two chapters, I explain how social paradigms work. I explain the basics of Burrell and Morgan, and then I introduce Anatole Rappaport and a lot of his ideas because those bring me into explaining functionalism. And then I spend two entire chapters, chapters 3 and 4, really hitting functionalism in every possible way. So I start with kind of the classics, right? We go into Napoleonic warfare. I talk about Clausewitz and Jomini, and then I bring us through World War One. And then after the first atomic bombs are dropped, that's where I argue that functionalism enters a new sort of phase, if you will, because nuclear
Yeah,
weapons are different. And it's important to really spend some time thinking about because they're existential. And so is artificial intelligence. Not to be a doomsday person, but there's a lot of concern. I write a lot about the rise of artificial general intelligence and how this may be an arms race where the weapon itself is produced that can define its own new ends beyond the human designers, right? And that's
yeah.
important. But I also talk about fascism, and I spend quite a bit of time in chapter 4 explaining fascism, which is a variation of functionalism, fits in there. And it also then ties into when you hear Marxists and fascists and capitalists argue, there's a lot of name calling, right? And a lot of shouting and screaming.
Yeah.
The problem, though, is that when a lot of Westerners will accuse an adversary or an opponent of being a Marxist. It's like, well, okay, when you use that word, what do you really mean? And a lot of times the person shouting past one another, they don't really know or they don't understand. And I explain the differences in radical structuralism, classical Marxism. That's later Marx after 1848. That's Marx and Engels. That's Lenin. That's Stalin, of course, Castro, all these different thinkers. And it links to Mao, who then, of course, creates the conditions for Z.
Mm.
Mao was pulling in Confucianism and Taoism and Chinese constructs that differed from Greco-Roman ones. Looking at, say, the Soviet Union and what Lenin was doing, you can't just copy and paste and say, "Oh no, now it's China today." That's wildly that oversimplifies it. The going back to the Marxist nuances here is that social Marxists are quite different and draw from different Marxist content, stuff written before 1848. So this is before Engels really started working with Marx. And this is early Marx, where he was drawing from different philosophical ideas, and it was much more subjective. So it wasn't tied to the same economic levers of capitalism and post-capitalism and making these communist arguments. It was different. And that's where you see some of those nuanced differences today, particularly with arguments against the West that are not grounded in, say, China or Venezuela or any Vietnam. And again, you got to put an asterisk next to a lot of these because they're not really communist societies, not in the
Right.
original sense. They're modified. They're living in a capitalist world with capitalist applications and machinery, but their rhetoric and their strategy and their philosophies are tied towards a different framework, an
Yeah.
eschatological framework, right? So again, interpretivism, though, I'm showing it in the graphic here. This is where I believe that we can take, and these graphics look very overwhelming for readers that haven't read the book. A lot of stuff here, but by the time you get to the eighth chapter, all this will make sense because we've built it incrementally along
Yeah.
the ways. But interpretivism tries to look at the other paradigms and then work and bridge across them. And this is
Mm,
what I make the argument at the end of the book, chapters 8 and then the conclusion, chapter 9, is that we can still live and operate in our favorite paradigm. So if you're a Western functionalist, Jomini or Clausewitz or Corbett or Mahan or Little Hart or Fuller, if that's your grounding, if the Boydian OODA loop is near and dear to your heart, you can still do that.
yeah,
But as an interpretivist, though, you recognize, you say, number one, I acknowledge that there's multiple war paradigms, and I use one of them. Number two, I know what my paradigm is, and I am insert your paradigm, right? So in this case, you're a functionalist. Okay. But I'm going to now use the interpretivist paradigm as a bridging vehicle, and I'm going to look at my adversary. And in this case, maybe my adversary is Hamas. So if you're the Israelis are functionalists too. So they're going to look at Hamas or the Iranians, and they'll say, all right, we are functionalists, they are not. What are they? So in the case of Hamas and Iran, they are variations of radical omnism. Right. So if we go forward a few slides here. So this is what interpretivism does. It allows you to kind of bridge and move around. And this is the final slide. This is the one that really ties everything up. It's in the conclusion. Unfortunately, so if we go down to here, we say this is functionalism, right? So let's say this is where the Israelis are today. Now
yeah,
there's a small amount of the Israeli Defense Force that are over here, and this is the design movement. And I talk about that in the 8th chapter. So the systemic operational design, which is still being taught at the Israeli general's course in Tel Aviv today. Right now, Shimon Nave, he was teaching there until recently. Now he's taking a sabbatical and is not with the school. So Dr. Ofer Gracier is the lead SOD facilitator. She's a very good friend, and she and I exchange a lot of emails. The Israelis have a small element that's over here. What amount of sod is being used in the current Israeli campaigns against the Hamas and Iran? I do not know, but I think that will be phenomenal content in the future that will probably be studied in great detail by military scholars. But
yeah,
but most of Israel is here into functionalism, and we say, okay, where are the Iranians? Where are the Iranians? Well, the Iranians are up here. This is radical omnism. And this is why when the Prime Minister of Israel is talking about how Iran has continued to say since the 1979 revolution that they want to destroy Israel, it is not destroy another state in a state system like functionalists say. It is
yeah,
a divine, messianic, eschatological decree. And Iran has shared that with many other radical groups, Branch Davidians being a great Christian example, right? So this is more American. Excuse me. This is more American, so those outside of the United States might not be familiar with who the Branch Davidians are, but this
no,
was
I've never
the
heard of them.
infamous Waco standoff with the
Yeah,
FBI
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah,
yeah, remember that? Yeah, and it ended in tragedy, but there are many other groups that work like this, and the Branch Davidians cannot be confused with white nationalist groups that I talk about in chapter 4. They're still down here in functionalism because fascism and functionalism are kind of hand in hand. I'm not saying that all functionalists are fascists. I'm absolutely not saying that, but I am saying that if you're in the functionalist paradigm, this is where you're going to probably put your fascists as well. There are nuances, but that's where they are. And so, say the I'm sorry, the Silent Brotherhood, which was a fascist white nationalist movement in the Pacific Northwest in the 1980s in the United States. I explain them as one example, the Ku Klux Klan being another, but they work as functionalists, and so they work down here. The Branch Davidians were different. They were trying to bring upon a end of the world, a doomsday. So the Iranians, at least their leadership and those that are driving their decision making work up in here and do the same thing. So do the Islamic State, right? And so does Al Qaeda. So does Al Qaeda in Iraq. So does the Muslim Brotherhood is different. You notice that I start with them in 1928 up here, but
yeah, yeah.
they've migrated and morphed into more of a quasi-functionalist entity. They don't still share a lot of the constructs they did through the 1950s and 60s. So I know that was Israel and Iran, but if we talk about, say, the United States and China, the United States being a largely functionalist, so that's the U.S. here, but China is up here. China's radical structuralist, right? And this is where Marx, this is where Mao, Ho Chi Minh, Giap, Che Guevara, Castro, the Weather Underground, all these different actors advocating these constructs. Radical structuralism differs because that is the kind of classic Marxist formula for how to bring about transformation of all social reality, or workers of the world unite. But they are different as Marxists from social Marxists, right? And so these are your advocates that are combining critical theory and postmodern concepts. So you've got Antifa,
Yeah,
you've
yeah.
got followers of Gramsci, Frankfurt School, the weather underground oscillates here intentionally, and I explain that in a book. And then Antifa leapfrogs all over the place because original anti-fascists in the 1920s through the 40s were very, very different from the anti-fascists or Antifa of today. Antifa today involved in some of the American issues that are going on, protests and different things. But the book Reconceptualizing War reconceptualizes all these things because if we don't look at it this way, we default into thinking about single paradigms. We go back to this. We go back to, okay, I'm a radical structuralist and you're looking at it through interpretivism. We're fighting over all this. We are shouting past each other and we're disregarding how we look at the world differently, and we're just doing tactical and operational fighting on battlefields, but we don't understand our different strategies, our different beliefs, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And here's another one. So this is functionalism versus interpretivism. This is a tension between the traditional doctrinal military majority for the West and what I frame as the design movement, the innovators, those that are utilizing complexity theory. Interpretivism differs, but together you can use two or more paradigms and gain benefits that you could not possibly achieve with just one paradigm.
So how would interpretivism and functionalism, how would that, you know, you talk about complexity theory, and this is what we advocate a lot on here, around looking at complexity theory and how that can help. How do you see that helps people now in the modern day to understand and adapt in this sort of volatile world?
Okay, great. Yeah, I love that question because it ties right into this graphic on figure 29. And this is in chapter 8, where I explain how interpretism works with all the different paradigms, all three. So if we take this graphic, what you see on the left is functionalism and reality is a stable system. This is where war has an unchanging nature, right? But it's got a changing character that, depending on the context, the geography, the technology, the belief systems, the different things that are socially constructed, your war's character can be different, but there's still these fundamental absolutes that govern all wars. And those use, again, very, very objective Newtonian constructs like centers of gravity, principles of war, elements of operational art, which all are physics based, right? Mass, maneuver, speed. So again, we see this, and part of that is because why is the modern functionalist military profession has hammered itself into a hard science, so to speak, or as Christopher Paparone, I love citing him, pseudoscience. And that's because after Napoleon kind of ran through Europe and shattered the earlier beliefs about how war was properly waged, militaries tried to professionalize. And so they looked to the movements of biology, chemistry, physics, engineering, and they modeled themselves off of that all the way down to the metaphors. So centers of gravity are a great example. If you go to a physics lab and if you talk about, there's for example, there's a company called Firefly. They just put something on the moon, and
Yeah.
they got a great mission that's coming up. This is just a commercial company, but again, think about it. We have commercial companies that are going to put things on other celestial bodies. That's just This is so exciting. It's so amazing. But for them, if you ask their engineers and their scientists, hey, can you explain to me lunar gravitational pull and orbits and geometry and all these things, right? They'll fill the whiteboards with mathematical formulas that are testable and provable and validated, right? And that's why they can put something on the lunar surface. Then you go and you look at what's in our military doctrine, whether it's British or Australian, Canadian, doesn't matter. They're all the same. And we look at our centers of gravity, that has none of that, right? It's just the metaphoric device that we stole because we wanted to sound more scientific.
Mm,
So that's part of that professionalization. So if we look on this slide here, functionalism, we like to reduce things down, break it down, right?
yeah.
PMISI, PT, politics, economics, information, all these different things, military. We use a modern construct versus a postmodern. And I know when you say postmodernism, a lot of folks will run in the opposite direction screaming, but not all postmodernism is quote unquote bad. Critical theorists will use it in ways that are very disruptive, and they're doing it intentionally. That's why they do it. But postmodernism has a lot of healthy elements that help us think about modernism in new and different ways. The Matrix movies, a great example. It's all based on a postmodern book by Baudrillard. Uh, they all the actors. Keanu Reeves had to read a Simulacra and Simulation as before the directors let him act, and it's a
Well, I didn't know
postmodern
that.
book. Yeah,
Yeah, that's
yeah,
cool.
yeah. It's and again, lots of good things. I enjoy a lot of postmodern ideas because it makes me think about modernism in different ways.
Mm,
Functionalism has reversible time, and what I mean by that is this actually is in my new book that's going to come out in the spring. I was one of my jobs in the Army. I was a National Training Center opposing forces commander, and
yeah,
those are the bad guys. So in these big giant training exercises, you have the good forces, right? And they're trying to get at training objectives and do things. And then you have to have bad guys. And the bad guys are supposed to do things and look like the real enemy that you're preparing to fight against. And so when I was directing opposing forces for some time at the Joint Readiness Training Center in Louisiana, we would have to do different exercises, different lanes, and then we had this free play, the big fights, right, where we had a lot more that we could do. But each time that the training force, the blue force, the good guys, the ones that were going to Iraq and Afghanistan, and they needed to get this training right. Like they had to figure out how to deal with V-beds or IEDs or suicide bombers. They had to get it right.
yeah,
So if my bad guys, if they got into a village and blew stuff up and just wrecked the place, the training center would then recock the exercise. They would reset it. We would go back in
yeah,
time, and
yeah,
everyone would
yeah,
say, "Time out, time out." They would teach the unit what they did wrong, and then the unit would then reset and get a second chance to do it correctly. This would happen in various training lanes, live fire exercises, then in free play in the box as well.
yeah,
And so the military looks at time as a functionalist as reversible. You can go back, you can go forward, you can freeze it, you can do all these different things. Whereas interpretivism looks at time as irreversible, no matter what, and this is complexity science, right?
yeah,
So no matter what you do, no matter what we say and do, our changes have a unstoppable, transformative effect,
yeah.
and you cannot go back. You cannot
No,
go back.
and I think that's where a lot of people struggle, especially when we talk about path dependence and stuff like that. Decisions we make now, how they then will constrain or even create opportunities in the future. But as soon as you act, you are changing something, and by change that nature of the change, you can't just turn it back. You've got to understand what constraints that's now brought to us, rather than thinking that you could just go back in time and it will be perfect.
Right, right. Yeah, absolutely. And if we think about, say, relationships, so your significant other, or if you're a parent, your children. And here's a great example. Like, how many times, if you're a parent, have you had a child when they're older, say, they're a teenager, and they'll remark to you, mom or dad or whoever, I remember you doing this one thing, and they bring up something that you don't even remember, and you must have said it years ago, but your kid remembers, and it was important.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
still remember it today. And that's the crazy thing is all the things you hope that they would remember, they don't. And then all the things that they do remember, it's like, what? You remember that? Why? I'll always remember when you did that. I get that a lot from my kids.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know, that
same.
reinforces to me that that's that irreversible thing that like each experience that we do, it's unique, it's custom, it's contextual. It's there's a lot of subjectivity. And that goes to that bottom bar there, objective reality versus perspectival reality. In one, if you figured out the proper formula on how to perfectly raise a child, you could stamp it and reproduce it and mass produce it, and then everybody could have perfect children. And perspective reality was like, nope, that'll never work. It'll never, ever, ever work. And even if you built something that was the perfect formula, you doing it has now changed the system. A dynamic system will adapt to it, and there'll
Yeah,
be
yeah, yeah.
something that will change. Yeah.
And and this is key for a lot of people working in strategy now is about context is key. Just because something worked in one context doesn't mean it's going to work in another. Looking at different perspectives across even the organization, even though we're all in the same organization, I can objectively look at it and go, well, this is what we do. Then that perspective may not be shared across the organization because they're seeing something slightly different. And it doesn't mean it's wrong compared to me. It just means it's different from their perspective. And um, I need to be
Yeah,
curious
yeah.
to understand what that is.
Right. I mean, a great example is in our military doctrine. And again, I'm a recovering planner myself. I always get a laugh out of that when I teach at a war college. But if we look at different doctrines, this is a great example here. If you're inside, and this is Miles' law, right? Where you stand depends on where you sit, and that fun little slogan is really a powerful one, right? So if you're, say, a United States Army, and say you're at Carlisle at the Army War College, objective reality, it's known that there are operational and strategic centers of gravity, usually two. There's a friendly and an enemy one.
Mm.
But there aren't tactical centers of gravity. Those are not real. Those are made up. They're false, right? But if you head down a few hours and you drive down to Quantico, Virginia, to where the Marine Corps has their war college, right? Much smaller, only about 35 people. But the Marines are learning about tactical centers of gravity because in Marine Corps doctrine, they do believe that there are tactical centers of gravity, whereas the Army says no, there are just the manifestations and the constructs that underpin your operational center of gravity, but there's no tactical center of gravity, right? So it's like who's right, who's wrong, and that's the wrong question. The
Yeah,
question isn't who's right and who's wrong. The question is how do we appreciate both of these
yeah,
different
yeah.
views? And I say interpretivism is one of the ways. And another great slide or slide I have somewhere in one of my briefing decks is each of the principles of war by different countries around the world, the French, the Americans, the Brits, the Chinese, the Soviet Union. It's an older slide, so it's got, the Soviet Union in there, so it's got to be pre 94. The thing is when you look at this and you look at all these different principles of war, remember those are the things that are supposed to be enduring,
Mm.
part of war's nature, right? It doesn't change. Well, wait a minute. How can we have this variation in epistemology across all these different nations? The wrong question is who's right, who's wrong, because that again reinforces single paradigm thinking. I'm right, everyone else is wrong. I don't care what you think, I'm going to beat you at war. Okay,
Yeah,
that's what we've been doing up until now. The better question is why is it that we have so much diversity of thinking at the ontological and epistemological levels? And that leads us to this. That leads us to looking at, say, slide 35 here. We've got different paradigms. We've got shifts of concepts. So even Clausewitz, Clausewitz went from an earlier state through 1827, a few years before his untimely death, but he was an idealist at that point. All of his writings, for the bulk of Clausewitz's life as a writer, as a military thinker, he went through a huge epistemological shift and became a realist in just the last 2 or 3 years of his life, where he was rewriting on war and really only got through 2.5 chapters of rewrites and then died.
mm.
So even with Clausewitz, when we talk about one of the military popes of functionalism, there's that shift that occurs.
Yeah.
And so there was also one with complexity science. There's a shift when it first went, complexity science from 1950s into the 1980s. But then there was a significant shift that occurred that moves it more into interpretivism. And then I talked earlier about the Marxist shift. So you had early Marx, 1837 to 1845-ish, and then he bounces over with Engels' help into radical structuralism. But the radical humanists really didn't start gaining traction until after World War One. So all of this is kind of backwards chronologically because most people, when you hear the word Marxist, you think a large state type system that's in conflict with the
Yeah.
idea of the state. But in it itself has to be a state or look like a state to continue the Marxist aspirations towards normatively changing reality towards a communist utopia that's global. But that's later Marx. That's later Marx that was manifested in the Lenin Revolution. So you have the Bolshevik Revolution, but the Bolshevik Revolution became a point of failure for those Marxists that were eagerly awaiting that revolution, the proletariat, to overthrow Berlin, to overthrow London, to overthrow Paris. That's where it was supposed to happen in a highly industrialized nation state with clear urban based worker class. And it didn't
Yeah.
happen. And so that's why radical humanism drew from early Marx to reinterpret, to work off of those failures and say, hey, Lenin and them, they got Marx wrong. They got Marx wrong. Here's how it's supposed to work, right? And that's why World War One was so important in terms of it built out all these different social paradigms because World War One mostly started with just functionalist states, and then you had a radical structuralist revolution occur by a small group of intellectuals within Russia. And they,
Yeah.
they were present in Germany. You had in the interwar period, certainly, you had battles between fascists and Marxists. But this is kind of what happened in the 20th century, and this is where we are today.
Yeah. And I like your point about not asking who's wrong is about understanding the different perspectives and where they got that from. Especially when you're thinking around how organizations construct themselves now to think there is just a way that we do things. And it must be done in this sequence because that's what we've always done and that's how we have to structure ourselves rather than thinking about different perspective of how you can do things and challenging actually the necessity for a lot of the structures they put in place. Are they are they needed, and is there other ways that we can do this, and how are we coupled with the external environment, and is our perspective that we're using, are we challenging our perspective?
Right, right. And again, Reconceptualizing War as a book, I do not advocate for war. I acknowledge that war, organized violence, it's something that's a characteristic that human beings, our species, have done since we've organized into societies. And there's no halt on how we creatively come up with new ways of waging conflict, right? There's lots of different ways that we do it. It's part of how our species is, and it's kind of one of the uglier, more brutal aspects of what it is to be a human versus not being a human.
Mm.
But going back to your point, is that I'm also not advocating that someone who, say, works at a war college, they should abandon Clausewitz and they should ignore Jomini, that, Machiavelli is wrong. And that's absolutely not what we're saying here. But what we are saying is if you adhere to a single paradigm and everything that you construct and think about for conflict is tied to one paradigm and denying the others and just saying, well, this is Marx, but Marx still obeys Clausewitz, right? So Lenin still had to use Clausewitz, and today President Z must still use Clausewitz and Jomini. Okay, that's part of the problem, is that if you're a functionalist and you use Reconceptualizing War, this book, well, then you can still be a functionalist, but you can then use interpretivism to gain a broader view, to better understand, say, Sino-Marxism, so that we can come up with better strategies of understanding and appreciating how to defeat China from, say, the
Yes,
American
yeah,
perspective. At the same time, the Chinese, if they wanted to, again, this book it's philosophy, so I can't control this. I don't want it to happen, but if the Chinese wanted to take the reconceptualizing war concepts and figure out how to be better at forming their strategies for radical structuralists to defeat functionalists, well, they could. And sadly, I think in any conflict, whether we're talking about Russia and the Ukraine, Israel and Iran, Israel and Hamas, or Western societies dealing with internal strife, and this is where we have the social Marxist movements, right? And this is where we are frustrated with not really understanding how much protest and violence is freedom of expression in a democratic society, in a plural society. But then when does it become something else where the nation state using, say, functionalism doesn't even realize that it is at war with a social Marxist movement? And that's, I know, a very, very spicy thing to say.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And I'll just leave it at that and say chapter 7 is all about that, because if you are, say, a radical humanist and you are waging war against the United States, against Great Britain, against France, a lot of the things that you see in the newspaper today is exactly what some of them are trying to do. And part of how they're able to do this so effectively is because the confusion and the obfuscation of these acts of organized violence make them appear to be something else. And the deception goes back to Sun Tzu, which is that
yeah,
all of warfare is a deception, right? And that's a very interesting thing, because Sun Tzu and Clausewitz don't really work well together, or Jomini, because Sun Tzu wasn't a functionalist. But yeah,
no,
this is where you can use these things to look at these different paradigms. And then once again, if you're a functionalist, be a functionalist, but be more than just a functionalist.
yeah,
If
yeah,
you're a radical structuralist, go, be one, but know yourself, know others, and then think more creatively than your adversary. And I believe the areas of innovation and creative thinking and critical thinking requires a multi-paradigmic view. If we
yes,
don't have this, we are at a handicap, and if our adversary has this, they have the advantage no matter what.
yeah, yeah,
That's kind of my
and
my thesis.
yeah, and that comes through in the book really well. And you're right; it's not saying that one is better than the other, or it's about how can we utilize the different perspectives. And you see this a lot with in modern strategy around. Well, I see it a lot where it's very functionalist. It's just the aspiration first, very stable, and we can achieve that rather than actually stopping to really understand what is being produced by the organization that we're in, what's actually happening outside, what is the perspective of our suppliers or our competitors or our collaborators, and stopping to understand these different perspectives to come up with something I think that will actually potentially have more weight and more that will actually work in this environment, rather than just thinking if we just do the same old thing again and again, that it will work. And also fall into that trap of just denying other perspectives, thinking that
Right.
any perspective beyond ours is wrong, where actually the only perspective that is wrong is denying someone else's. And actually, we can learn a lot if we just pause. And like you see this a lot with modern media and stuff like that. They get people that are completely opposite polar ends of the spectrum, and they just shout at each other. And there's no one really there to, like you say, take the interpretivism role and sit there and actually listen to understand what they're saying, and actually realizing where are the commonalities that we have, and what are the differences, and why are these
Right, right.
differences coming around?
Yeah, yeah. Your point on technology and information and the speed at which things happen. We have probably three buckets of listeners right now, right? And some will say, "Yep, that's me," when I mention these three buckets, right? So the modern those people born and don't know what a Blockbuster video card is or video rental
Yeah.
card, right?
Yeah.
That's one bucket, and those are our younger listeners in the up and coming. And for them, they've had this amazing reality of smart technology and instant information, and it's so different. If you were ever using a dial-up phone to call your video store to tell them that you're late on returning your VCR tape, you're in the second category, and that's my generation, probably, and
I
yours
mean,
as
yeah.
well, right? And so if we think back to when we were younger, information and these processes moved. We still had plenty of wars, we had lots of technology, but things moved slower. And things were not as dynamic and complex as they are today in terms of just how fast things can go viral and how fast misinformation and disinformation can hit millions of people. The third bucket, though, we got to go old school, is there's a whole generation of people that if you wanted to watch something on television, well, you better get there and look at the TV guide and sit down and turn it on, and there it is. And
Yeah.
once it's over, right?
Yeah.
And that's the generation just, before us. They didn't have VCRs. The technology was different. But the media back then was different as well. There was a defining moment for the American Vietnam War, 1968, 69 period, I think 68, where Walter Cronkite, after the Tet Offensive, looked to the camera and said, essentially, I don't believe we're going to win this war.
Yeah. I remember that.
Yeah, and when historians look back at that, that's when policymakers and military senior leaders realized they had lost the American public. And that was in a period where if a media figurehead, if Walter Cronkite or Dan Rather looked at the screen and told you something, you dosh darn believed it, right?
Mm.
But now look at these three buckets. You have the older bucket and how things were much slower, very traditional. You've got our bucket, you and I, where we were the Gen X type growing into this technology. And then you've got the latest generation where someone on TikTok or a social media influencer has more power than whoever's on ABC News or
Yeah. Yeah.
whatever author is writing in the London Times or the New York Times, right? So we live in a much more dynamic, complex reality coupled with all of the existential threats that we've collected along the way. So we've got nuclear, we've got chemical, we've got biological, and now we're bringing in artificial intelligence and quantum, and we're expanding into the space domain. And there's all these things that are happening that are amazing, but there's a lot of existential elements to it. And so conflict is wrapped up in all of these things. So it's a very, very
Yeah.
different world that we're in. And this is where we need an understanding of multiple war paradigms. We must do this. We cannot continue to do things the old way, or
Yeah.
we will. Here's what we will do. And there's a pattern of this with the United States, at least. We're very good tactically, and we're pretty darn good operationally. So we can win on the battlefield easily, but we don't win our wars anymore.
No.
We kind of grind to a stalemate, and then we
Yeah.
lose interest and leave. Yeah,
Again,
and that's the problem.
yeah, and that really brings back to the essence of why I established this podcast. Is really challenging around um, the traditional or orthodoxy around strategy, and actually how can we take a different perspective or utilize other perspectives to ensure that our strategy can actually meet reality, so we don't go into this stalemate like they are. But it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you about this. What would you like to leave listeners to think about from the podcast?
Well, if you've stuck with us this long, I appreciate it. And clearly, if you've hung on and you're all at the if you're at this point of the podcast, you're clearly a deep thinker and you're very interested in more beyond the superficial because anybody can enjoy watching the tactics of conflict. They're exciting. People play video games. My kids are always playing Call of Duty. And you look at
Yeah,
that and you
same.
go, all right, that is a simulation of the tactics, and a lot of it's wildly inaccurate. The tactics themselves are a misnomer because The bullets, I said there's the bullets, the bombs, the protest signs, all those things are things that happen at a certain level. But if we neglect and fail to understand, number one, what is my paradigm? Everyone has to point that at them. What is my paradigm? And for people that cop out of that and will say, well, I don't really believe in the social paradigms, or I looked at the social paradigm theory and I just don't see any of those that really construct what I believe. So I'm different, right? That is an intellectual cop out. That is intellectual laziness, because that is a person or people who don't even want to have the discussion because they're unwilling to risk saying, this is my box. We all have boxes. Everyone works within a social paradigm. Now, which one you're in is up to you, but that's the first step. The second step is recognizing there are different paradigms out there, and then recognizing that our adversaries, they might work inside of our paradigm, and that's relatively useful, right? I think the Ukraine-Russia conflict is much more like that. It's mostly functionalist versus functionalist, right?
Yeah.
So there's not a whole lot of philosophical inquiry you can do if they're like-minded, but at the same time, yes, there is, in that you can look and take a multi-paradigmic view. And so if you want, say, the Ukrainians to prevail, well, are there advantages in the other paradigms, interpretivism, radical structuralism, radical humanism, that if the Ukrainian strategy adapted those, could they exploit a vulnerability that the Russian functionalists are currently using and unaware of? That's how you do it at that high philosophical level. Then those policymakers, those strategists, those senior leaders, those military leaders that are commanding large organizations and are chartered with organizational change and innovation and creativity, they can then create new strategies that lead to operations, that lead to tactics, and you can have different outcomes, right? That's the so what. However, none of this will work if we continue to just say, this is my paradigm and yours is stupid. Yours is wrong, and I don't care. I had that conversation once with a senior intel analyst in Afghanistan, and he said essentially, I don't care what the Taliban think. This is their enemy, a strategic center of gravity, whether they know it or not, and that's it, and that's final.
Yeah.
And it was like, okay.
Yeah, and that was it. I was out in Iraq and Afghanistan like yourself, and I could see it from where we were on the battlefield that we were trying to operate in a paradigm that was different to theirs, but not adapting.
Yeah.
And we
Yeah.
just thought that we could just carry on the way we are. We couldn't adapt quick enough because we weren't willing to recognize and observe. I suppose in your term now, willing to own our paradigm, but then see it from a different perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And the differences between Al Qaeda and Taliban are significant. They were
Yeah,
using different paradigms, right?
yeah,
The Taliban are mostly falling into, right now at least, the functionalist paradigm. They're just on the border. They're over to radical omnism just enough with what they're doing with a lot of the Islamic Sharia law type stuff. But the Taliban differ from Al Qaeda. We kind of lumped them in together, and we fought them using a purely functionalist construct that the coalition utilized, and it hasn't changed. We haven't. Now we've changed technology, we've changed tactics. We're using more drones. We're doing more EW. We're doing more atmospheric. We're doing more space. We're doing more cyber. We're doing all this great stuff today. But we haven't changed our strategies. We haven't
no,
changed our doctrines, and we're not going to change our war paradigm because we don't want to. And that's a huge disadvantage, I think, going into the next series of conflicts if we have them, particularly with the increased volatility we have of these new existential threats. And I say that, is artificial intelligence an existential threat? I say yes and. Yes and. I don't say yes and no. I yes and, because it is, with the potential, but the and part is important, because if we do things right, advanced, strong AI is going to transform the world in many positive ways, many positive ways, if we do it right.
yeah,
If we're
yeah,
careless, if we're reckless, if we're trapped in single paradigms, I
yeah.
don't know.
Yeah, and it's great to think, and I urge listeners to, to pick up Ben's book, because I think this is really important, and you bring out the issue around that strategic level, and that's what we're trying to advocate here, is about actually let's look at a different perspective, different paradigm of how we can utilize this to create better strategies, different strategies that would enable us to be successful, be it whatever your preference is, for profit, for good, for collaboration. There's difference there rather than just the traditional winning aspiration and structuralism of just focus on capabilities, etc. But it's been great to have you on, Ben. And
It's great to talk with you as a fellow veteran and wrestling with these strategic issues. And there's really, it's a small community of people that are worried about things at this level. But I applaud your work and thank you for having me on.
Oh no, it's a pleasure. Absolute pleasure, mate. And I look forward to speak to you again soon. And I'll link Ben's book to the show notes. And if you like the episode, please share to your wider audience and like it and subscribe and support the channel. Thank you, Ben. I'll speak to you soon.
All righty.